To you, Carla.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Charlie, and thank you for the invitation and the really great organization of this morning already. So yeah, very much in line with the kind of topic of today, keeping runners running. I'm going to talk you through some psychological strategies that you may, hopefully, for those who put your hands up earlier on and going to run tomorrow, you'll find useful, and hopefully by the end of it, you'll come away with an if-then plan for tomorrow. So let me ask you a question, and can you show your hands if you can relate to this question? If you can answer yes to the question, whether you've ever had any thoughts around the urge to stop or slow down when you hadn't planned to do so, when it wasn't part of your pacing plan. So can I just see a show of hands? And maybe just have a think about what was it about that situation that triggered some of those thoughts around the urge to stop or slow down. Just maybe spend like a few seconds around thinking about the why. So let me just reassure you, this is something that's very normal. We did a survey with well over 700 runners, so 761 runners, I believe, and 95% of those said yes to that exact same question. They predominantly experienced those thoughts, as you'd expect, in the second half of the event, and more so in the third quarter than the fourth quarter. And they cited a whole range of reasons as to why they're doing that. So kind of going back to the question I just asked you, have a think about why you're experiencing that. They had physical reasons, so maybe injury, pain. They had physiological reasons, so feeling tired, fatigue, but also maybe not sticking to their nutrition plan, not taking enough water, missing some of the water stations, maybe not taking that energy gel, not slept well. There were also environmental reasons, so Charlie already alluded to the weather earlier on, being worried about the weather tomorrow. Well, it's a bit outside of your control, but not actually taking into account those weather conditions, so misjudging the wind, maybe it's a little bit windy, bit of headwind. Very warm a couple of years ago at the London Marathon, it was a lot warmer, so that kind of fed in a lot of those thoughts around the urge to stop or slow down. And there were also a range of psychological reasons, so their mind was maybe telling their legs to slow down when they hadn't planned to do so. Their mind wasn't in it. Or they say other people were walking and they were starting to entertain that thought, oh, maybe I should be doing that as well when I hadn't planned to do so. So that's just a bit of an introduction to what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to draw both of my experiences as a researcher in the field on endurance performance, so I edited a book on it, but also I'm going to talk about my experience as a chartered sport and exercise psychologist who works with endurance runners. So it's a bit more of a practical talk. We'll be drawing on some of our research. Talking through some kind of strategies that you may be able to use. And as I said earlier on, hopefully by the end of today, you'll have an if-then plan that you can use when you're going out and run tomorrow. So from that experience, we kind of identified 4 demands that are quite typical when it comes to endurance performance, and obviously a marathon in particular, taking into account the topic of today. So the first being pain and discomfort. So when you're maybe getting to mile 20, 21, probably your legs might hurt, yet you're going out and do it. So that kind of volitional nature of exposing yourself to discomfort and pain is quite unique when it comes to endurance performance. And then there's also that element of motivation. So you might recall some of those longer training runs, getting out when it's dark, maybe raining, cold, windy, finding that motivation to get out there and get those miles in the bank can be quite tough. Because ultimately, when we think about endurance performance, you need to put in the training hours, you need to put in those miles in the bank. So how do you draw on kind of intrinsic motivation, having clarity around the reasons why you're doing it? It's another kind of psychological demand when it comes to endurance performance. And then there's also the component of pacing. So when we think about endurance performance, it's that kind of continuous whole body exercise that tends to be, at least 75 seconds or more, when that kind of aerobic energy system tends to predominate. So that kind of pacing component starts to kick in. You can't go at 100% of effort for the whole duration of a marathon. It's just not feasible. So that component of pacing is really important. How do you get to that finish line in some kind of acceptable state, if you like? And then there's also that duration. So when you think about endurance, you'll be on your feet for a good couple of hours. The elite will be maybe a little bit quicker, but most of you will be a couple of hours that you'll be on the course. So there's a lot of time for your thoughts to clash So, there'll be some time for maybe the demons to come in play. So how do you manage some of those thoughts, perhaps around that urge to stop or slow down, or kind of maybe getting very caught up in how you might be feeling that kind of pain and discomfort? And in some of our other research, we looked into some of those kind of psychological demands across kind of endurance events. And we also identified concerns around training. So those of you who are going out and run tomorrow, maybe you're starting to question your training plan. Have I done enough training? But also, maybe you feel the pressure because of the time you've kind of had to spend away from your family and friends. So kind of those lifestyle sacrifices can be something that can really add to some of that pressure. Maybe you had a niggle, maybe you had a cold in the last couple of weeks, so concerns around that, so how are you going to accommodate for that? And then there's also the practicalities. So, we got London Marathon, one of the biggest events. Toilets are typically, when it comes to endurance events, always a bit of a practical worry. So if that plays on your mind too much and you're trying to control the uncontrollables, well, you have to queue in the end of the day. So how are you going to account for that is something to take into consideration, as well as, not getting maybe overly excited at the start and kind of throwing overboard your pacing plan. So these are just some kind of demands and kind of concerns that we identified. But what's interesting is to kind of understand what some of psychological factors are that may impact endurance performance. So this is something that we looked at in a systematic review a couple of years ago. And what we identified, that there were two kind of main psychological factors or determinants that help to promote or kind of benefit endurance performance, these being motivation and self-efficacy. So things like verbal encouragement, head-to-head competition was one that came out, and kind of that intrinsic motivation. And there's also that kind of idea of self-efficacy. So it's the I believe I can kind of idea. So that's self-belief. And what we know from self-efficacy is that previous performance accomplishments are typically kind of the most powerful source and predictor of that self-belief. And in our research on self-efficacy in kind of endurance, we identified that it's not just kind of a one-off good performance, but it's an accumulation of good performances and good, strong training sessions that will really boost that kind of self-belief. So it's really important for you to have a think about, okay, what are the good training sessions that I've had that I can really draw that kind of self-belief from going out into the marathon tomorrow? And that's more important than trying to kind of get caught up in maybe having done one bad session as part of your training plan. So draw on those kind of really good, overall strong training achievements. And then there's also, and this is more unique to endurance performance, those physiological states. So maybe at the start of your training plan, one of the longer runs, your RPE was quite high, so it felt quite hard. But actually reflecting on how that becomes easier, it feels easier throughout your training plan as you've progressed, is something that can really boost that self-efficacy as well. And then on the other hand, we found that things like emotion suppression and mental fatigue were types of things that undermined endurance performance. So it's really important to not try to get caught up in how you're feeling. Maybe you're anxious, maybe you're frustrated too much, because that's really going to be something that increases that kind of perceived effort and undermines that performance. So maybe redirect your attention rather than trying to suppress your emotions is not particularly helpful. And then we also looked at kind of interventions that could benefit endurance performance, and we found that things like goal setting, self-talk, pre-performance statements, as well as imagery were types of things that can benefit performance. So let's go back to, the topic, keeping runners running, thoughts around the urge to maybe stop or slow down. One of the things that, you might entertain that thought of getting caught up and worrying that you're not going to reach your target time. Does that ring a bell? Anyone experience that? So that might be something that could be a bit of a thing during a marathon. So what can you do? So we'll have a look at some of those mental strategies now. So I'm predominantly going to talk about those first two, so like goal setting and self-talk. I've done some research on that. But because we found imagery has been quite beneficial in terms of endurance performance, just quickly want to touch on that as well as smiling. So imagery is kind of that creating or recreating an experience in your mind. Although it's usually referred to as visualization, we're using all our different senses. So it's all about, what you're hearing. You might hear spectators, what you're feeling, what you're tasting, and so on. And you can use it for different purposes. So it might be that you're creating an experience of success in your mind. So seeing yourself, getting onto the mall and like finishing that finish line and kind of the feel of having the medal hung around your neck, if you opted for the medal this year, that is. There might also be things like maybe you're imagining fresh air, like you're breathing, powerful breathing to kind of refresh the oxygen levels in your body and kind of power through. So you could use imagery for a range of reasons that can be very beneficial towards performance, recalling some of those training sessions, for example, to boost that self-efficacy. And then there's also smiling. So Noel Brick, who's at Ulster University, has done some research around the effects of smiling on endurance performance. And what he identified was that smiling has a positive effect on RPE. So our rate of perceived effort goes down when we're smiling. And that might happen for a couple of different reasons. It might be that actually what you're doing is redirecting your attention. So when you're smiling, you tend to kind of engage more with the people around you. You might be running tall a little bit more, stand up a bit more upwards when you're starting to smile. So there's different reasons why that might benefit RPE. And this is actually something that Kipchoge does quite purposefully when you see him running the marathon. He's been talking about that as well. So that's just kind of two other things, but I'm predominantly going to talk about goal setting and self-talk. So that example that I gave earlier on about, maybe being worried about your target time is something that's quite common when it comes to marathons. So often, people who are going to, if you're going to run tomorrow, people are going to ask you what's your target time. And typically what happens is people have a do or die goal. So they're like, that's my set goal, that's the one I'm going to go for. But actually what that does, it's going to cause you a lot of pressure on a day. You've done your training and actually the conditions might be perfect. Maybe the weather tomorrow is just as you wanted it to be. You've had a good night of sleep and you're going for the dream goal. You're going for that kind of target goal. But sometimes maybe you haven't eaten that well, you haven't slept that well, you're going and revert back to that happy goal, and that's okay. And sometimes you've just had a really bad week at work, you haven't slept, maybe you had a cold, and you just want to get round. So having that kind of flexibility takes off that pressure. And what it also means is, maybe you had a bad kind of week at work, you haven't slept well, maybe you have young children keeping you awake at night, and you're kind of going for that acceptable goal. But actually, you're crossing Tower Bridge and you're feeling really strong. So you might be kind of getting yourself back up to a happy goal or that dream goal. So giving yourself that kind of flexibility moves away from having that do or die goal, that pressure, and kind of looking beyond performance only. And I think that's relevant when we're looking at quality of goals. So we're sometimes getting very caught up in just setting kind of these performance-based goals. But what's really important to kind of keep you going is to reflect on those kind of meaningful goals. So what's your reason for running the marathon? There's a lot of people out there tomorrow who are running for a charity. And maybe that charity is very personal to them. So actually reflecting on why you're going out there tomorrow, your reasons for running that, can really help you through some of those difficult moments, or maybe countering some of those thoughts around the urge to stop or slow down when you hadn't wanted to do so. And then there's also the importance of setting goals that you have autonomy over. So yeah, it's helpful having like a performance, a time-based goal. It kind of informs your training plan. Some of you might have these outcome goals as well. Maybe you want to be the best of your running club. Maybe you want to beat a friend. But what that kind of an issue, if you like, with that is it's not always something you've got control over. So what's helpful is to really start thinking about some process goals. So obviously in London, you've got the blue line. It can be quite helpful following the blue line to kind of stick to as close to the marathon distance as possible. Because there's so many people, you might be zigzagging a little bit more and maybe you're running quite a few 100 meters extra. Could affect your target time, obviously. But there's also things like smiling could be a process goal. Maybe things like smile every mile could be part of your process goal. Engaging with the audience. I spoke to some people who said, actually going out to such a, fun marathon, actually my goal is going to be to take in all the sights. So that's something that they have a lot more control over. Maybe it is running tall. Maybe it's not kind of racing off at the start of the event and having self-talk statements like steady, Medi, or even Stephen. And there's also the idea of chunking. So what can be very helpful, rather than seeing it as a one big, 26.1 mile event, you can break it down. So one thing that people often refer to as only one park run to go towards the end. We can think about breaking it down in maybe 3 different parts. So settling into a pace at the start, really focusing on your running technique in the middle, and then dig deep towards the end, which is what they were talking about in the video when you entered. I don't know if you managed to listen to that. So that's goal setting. Another thing that we looked at is self-talk. So I already kind of talked about some self-talk statements in terms of kind of, even Steve and steady Medi is kind of instructional, helping yourself to kind of stick to a pace. But self-talk can also be motivational. So it might be things like dig deep, psyching yourself up and to increase effort. And what we kind of identified from a systematic review, when we looked at those different psychological interventions, we did a quality assessment. Actually, what we identified was that a lot of the kind of experimental research around psychological interventions is quite weak. And I guess when it comes to sports psychology research and interventions, you have to remember that it's quite difficult to unlearn an intervention. So when you think about some of the kind of nutritional research, there might be a washout period where you give someone a supplement. So you can have the kind of, repeated measure type design, which is really difficult when, let's say you've taught someone how to use self-talk, and then you say, well, actually, why don't you just forget about what I've just learned, what you've just learned, and just don't use it at all. That's something that's really difficult to do with some sports psychology research. So having these kind of, types of design can be a little bit more difficult as such. As well as some ethical issues. If you know something works, why would you hold people back from prescribing an intervention that's effective? So what we did in this study is we tried to accommodate for that somewhat through having an active control condition. So again, what we found is that a lot of the studies that we evaluated didn't have a control condition. So what we did is we recruited participants who were doing a 60-mile overnight self-supported race, and they were randomly allocated to either a self-talk condition. So what they did in this condition is they were given a workbook for a 2-week period where they would reflect on their use of motivational self-talk statements in their training sessions, and they had to identify the ones that worked that they could then take with them into the event for kind of breaking that event down in 3 pieces. And the active control condition kind of matching for expectancy and time, we asked them to look at a numbers grid and under kind of time pressure, practice searching numbers in those 2 weeks leading up. And actually what was in our favor, there's a website that promotes this. We know from research it's not particularly helpful, it doesn't benefit or boost performance, but we could definitely kind of manage that expectancy effect as such. So there was some kind of, so Nick talks about that pseudoscience there. So what we found is that there was support for the use of motivational self-talk. However, you can see it was slightly underpowered, it's a trivial effect size. But actually what was more interesting is that most participants, when we asked them 6 months down the line whether they were still using the interventions, by far the majority of the self-talk group were still using it. And that's something that's quite helpful to reflect on. We asked them about their satisfaction with the intervention. So rather than just looking at the efficacy of an intervention, so whether, maybe it has a performance effect, we also need to consider that effectiveness of an intervention. So why are people still using it? Did they enjoy using it? So a combination of those two is quite helpful. And I think as a sports psychologist, I'm interested in the well-being of people. I'm not just interested in whether it's about performance. So we need to kind of move a little bit beyond just looking at performance as an outcome, but also at other factors that can, going out and enjoy the marathon tomorrow and not just honing in on the performance. It's important, but it's not the only thing. That's, I guess, the message I want to relay there. So in practical terms, what might that look like? So let's say you're combining goal setting, chunking with using self-talks. There's some examples of types of things you could do. And what's really important is that if you're drawing on self-talk, keep it brief. You don't want to have to remember really difficult kind of statements that maybe not that right for you, maybe something that, one of the people you run with use, but it doesn't mean much for you. So make sure that self-talk statements, think about your training runs, what worked for you. Was dig deep something that was very meaningful to you? Or maybe just checking in with your running form at those kind of middle miles. Weather, always a big one. So if the weather's awful, how can you move away from kind of trying to control the uncontrollable? It might be reminding yourself that the weather's out of your control, time to adjust my goal, or maybe have a think about wearing an extra layer or a layer less going on the course. So what does this then mean? We know about these psychological strategies. We might have heard about self-talk or imagery or goal setting, and often we have really good intentions of using different strategies to help manage some of those difficult situations that we may encounter. But actually, when it comes to it, we forget about it. So there's kind of a gap between all these good intentions and putting that into action. And this is something where implementation intentions, or what we call if-then planning, might be quite helpful. So let's say you're telling yourself you're tired, you can't do it. You can already start thinking about, okay, what are some strategies that I can put into place to help counter some of those thoughts? It might be that you're redirecting your attention away from those thoughts more onto the kind of the focus on your running and kind of your running stride. Maybe your breathing strategy, checking in with your breathing. Maybe do a tense and relax. Maybe your shoulders are very tight. So there's different types that you can do there. And it doesn't necessarily just have to be like a self-talk statement, goal setting. It can also be about your nutritional strategy. Maybe you're going to treat yourself to, a secret like piece of a protein bar that's kind of your emergency bar. It might be something, if I entertain these thoughts a lot consistently, actually that's the time to treat myself to something nice. It might be looking forward to the roast dinner afterwards. It's Sunday after all tomorrow. So there's different things that you can do to have that already in place. And that's helpful because actually what you're trying to do is you're trying to have the automatic link between what's going on, some of those thoughts around the urge to stop or slow down possibly, and having already thought about that plan kind of activates that plan in the moment. So if you are out to run the marathon tomorrow, I can't remember whose hands were up earlier, but you know who I'm talking to, write down your if-then plan. So think about what might be some things that maybe I'm a bit concerned about going into the marathon tomorrow. What can I do? What's a plan that I can put in place that's feasible? So don't try anything new. Don't suddenly try to change your running shoes, is what I tell. So similarly, don't try to do it dramatically, imagery. If you've never used it before, don't go out and do it tomorrow. But if you've used self-talk statements in your training that worked really well for you, try to activate them and make them part of your if-then plan. Say it out loud. This is important because otherwise it will be really hard to remind yourself of it in the morning. And maybe you can write it down on your bib, maybe you can write it on your hand, maybe you can put a sticker on your energy gel, whatever works for you to remind yourself of that. Maybe you've got spectators along the course, give them a quick call and say, make me a nice sign with my if-then plan. Might be something that could work for you. Importantly, however, do not wait for that critical situation to happen. So there's some studies conducted at the University of Constance, where what they found in experimental studies where they asked people to put together an if-then plan, the participants were just anticipating that critical situation to happen, and that kind of held them back. So it felt more effortful because they were waiting for that to happen, and it didn't. It didn't happen for everyone. So tomorrow might be your day for that dream goal. So there we go. That's it for me. I was going to plug my book. I completely forgot about that, so I'm going to do that as well. So I've written a book a little bit different from endurance performance, but it's about how can you apply sports psychology to the maternity journey. So actually, when we think about pregnancy, it's a bit of an endurance feat. So I've written a book on that called Empowered Birth, Lessons from Sports Psychology for you in maternity journey. Anyway, these are some people I've worked with, so thank you very much for, as part of the kind of Resist working group, and for you going out tomorrow, remember your if-then plan and enjoy the marathon. And remember to smile, because we know that can reduce your RPE.
Thank you very much, Carla. Does anybody have any questions before we go to the break for Carla? Yes, we've got one at the front over here. Microphone is coming.
Hi. I was just wondering do you think this is transferable to other endurance events as well? So like cycling or long distance adventure racing or like military courses?
Yeah, 100%. So most of the research we've done is around endurance performance more generally. So when I talked about those kind of 4 demands and the different concerns around training, they're more kind of broadly in terms of endurance performance. So kind of the book I've edited on endurance performance in sport is around, there's a lot of cycling in there, but it applies to, you know, cross-country skiing and so on. So that kind of when that pacing component kicks in, that kind of whole body continuous exercise without start-stopping is kind of where we hope this applies to.
Thank you.
Given that endurance performance can take often years to develop peak optimal performance, from your study, do you feel like it would be worth following up the candidates at 5 years, 10 years to see how the self-talk programs have affected their performance?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, especially when it comes to psychological interventions, there's not actually that much research in terms of how long it takes for those to be optimally effective. And with endurance performance, as you say, it takes time to get stronger. So you need to adjust, you know, the types of psychological interventions accordingly. So, you know, when that RPE feels harder at the start, you need to understand, kind of, you know, measure the mediators. So things like self-efficacy, how that progressed over time. What the optimal duration is, I'm afraid there's no research literally on that to share with you. So there's some that kind of shows that 2 weeks can be a kind of a minimum for things like a self-directed self-talk statement workbook, but it's a little bit more complex than that. So we have individualized approaches like one-to-one work as a sport and exercise psychologist, and that can take years. You know, with some of my clients, you know, it's not a 6 to 10 week type intervention that you're working with. So it's really difficult to kind of answer that question in terms of, is there a gold kind of standard duration as to how long this takes? Behavior is very complex.
Excellent, thank you. We'll do one more question over there.
Hi there. Is there any particular phrases or words that might be more effective than others for self-talk?
Good question. The answer is no, because it's quite individualized. There's a lot of research around whether it's better to use motivational or instructional self-talk. There's some research around that. It depends on the reasons why you're using self-talk. So you might be using, I think typically motivational self-talk, like to use that more towards the end of a race when you kind of need to do things like dig deep. There's certain things that are quite common, like things like dig deep is a very common kind of word, but it has to be meaningful to you. So you need to first kind of reflect on what are your reasons for doing the event, what are your process goals, and then align your self-talk statements accordingly, rather than having kind of one or two that are generically helpful across the board as such. So there's no kind of research to support the idea that there's one or two kind of self-talk statements that are beneficial.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Carla.